This next speaker, Professor Joshua Mitchell, I had the honor of meeting, I believe, a little over a year ago, where he was on this campus and gave a very interesting talk in the area of political theory, philosophy, religion, values, you name it. What struck me by his talk, his presentation, was the depth of analysis, the thoughtfulness of covering the subject matter, and the fact that he brings to our attention matters and issues that all of us really need to reflect on. And so when he accepted to do this presentation, I was so thrilled because he has traveled very far to be here. So, and you'll see why in a minute. He's really right now stationed or teaching in Qatar. And so I'm grateful that he would accept to do this talk at this conference. Professor Mitchell is currently professor of political theory at Georgetown University. He has been chairman of the government department and also associate dean of faculty affairs at the School of Foreign Service in Qatar. His research interest lies in the relationship between political thought and theology in the West. His most recent book, Tocqueville in Arabia, Dilemmas in the Demographic Age, was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2013, and he will do a book signing immediately after his talk in the back. The book is available. Other books he has written, and I'll just feature 3 of them here. Not by Reason Alone, Religion, History, and Identity in the Early Modern Political Thought. The Fragility of Freedom, Tocqueville on Religion, Democracy, and American Future, both published by the University of Chicago Press. And finally, Plato's Fable on the Moral Condition in Shadowy Times was published by Princeton University. I also have to share with you, and you may be interested to know, that Professor Mitchell is an avid conservationist working to restore his small forest on the Eastern Shore in Maryland, and working to develop the next generation of solar electric sailboats. So isn't it interesting that he follows Professor Bowerman's talk on water security? Please welcome Professor Joshua Mitchell.
Thank you, Huda, very much for inviting me. Quick background. So I came out of sociology and about 30 years ago shifted to political theory. I'm really a Tocqueville scholar. In 1989, when I finished my PhD, I, of course, didn't have a job like everybody else, and took a 1-year postdoc and went to the library at Chicago and opened up Tocqueville's Democracy in America and read the first 11 pages of the author's introduction, and I closed the book, and I said, I will spend the rest of my life with this author, and I have. And then in 2005, I went to Doha, the Georgetown campus in Doha, and was on the startup team. And then also in 2008 to 2010, I was the acting chancellor of the American University of Iraq in Kurdistan. And all of my work is around the terminology that we use to understand human existence. To me, it's far more mysterious than our language can name. And while I've been in the Middle East, I've noted that a certain perplexity that many of my students have when we talk about life in terms of values and preferences and identity. It's not self-evident to them that this is actually the best sort of language, or that this is indigenous language that they can use. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what it means to live in a global age and whether in fact we're going to get there. So what I want to do today is talk about the term values. I think we're entranced today by the prospect that we can achieve some sort of consensus about global values. I think more than this, there is an ill-defined but palpable longing for unanimity that registers around the world, especially, I think, among cosmopolitan fellow travelers who mediate and travel between the nations. But I think while today's cosmopolitans have a clear view of the parochialisms that are involved when you focus on nations or localities, there isn't yet a positive account of what the overarching and inclusive global values could possibly be. In these remarks, what I want to do is draw attention to a few authors from the Western tradition, the ones that I've lived with really for 30 years, in order to raise questions of the following sort. First, the term that the longing for unanimity is couched in. Second, the source of that longing for unanimity. Third, the limitations to which mortal life is subject, which makes the identification of global values, I think, highly unlikely. And fourth, assuming it's impossible, the sort of aspirations, sort of global values that we might find helpful. My conclusion is that we will never achieve such a consensus and that we should not even aim for it, because unanimity does not fall within the purview of mortal life. But that should not be a counsel of despair. To the contrary, this realization points us in the direction of global pluralism, which I take to be the ethical challenge of the 21st century. Let me start with the term value. I do so because the term is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and as such, it's a candidate that we might find tempting to stand in as the genus that contains the plurality of accounts, the species, of the human situation around the globe. The term is also suited, I think, because it generally designates something that we deeply believe. I have a deep value, right? These are my values. There's a problem, however, with the term, I think, right from the outset. Its most prominent and incisive formulation was really given by Nietzsche in the last half of the 19th century. But Nietzsche used the term as a withering critique against both the Anglo-American world and against Christianity. And so the term value really has this latent critique of notions of interest and of Christianity. And this, to me, is actually a very, very large problem. To anticipate where I'm going, because there are so many deeply religious people around the globe, I'm worried that the term value is already aligned against them. So in casual use, we use the term value and the term preference interchangeably. On further reflection, we generally acknowledge that values are somehow deeper than our preferences. In Nietzsche's work, especially in the Genealogy of Morals, which I would all recommend that you go out and read if you haven't, we find the intellectual root of the intuition that human beings are oriented by more than mere preferences. On Nietzsche's view, only the Anglo-Americans, this German suspicion of the Anglo-Americans, they were the ones who believed in this notion of preferences. He says, it was out of the pathos of distance between human beings that noble souls first seized the right to create values and to coin names for values. What had they to do with utility? Of course, the English tradition is the utilitarian tradition. The viewpoint of utility is as remote and inappropriate as it could possibly be in the face of such burning eruptions of the highest rank ordering, rank defining value judgments. For here, feeling has attained the antithesis of that low degree of warmth that mere calculating prudence presupposes. So for Nietzsche, preference supposes a kind of careful weighing, and Microeconomics 101 is this. It's sort of, I have this preference, or I have that preference. It's a balancing, yes? And on Nietzsche's reading, only a certain person would want this happiness associated with careful balancing and weighing, namely the Englishmen, who are for him terribly boring. This is market commerce, if you're thinking about it, right? The rest of us want creativity, passion, meaning, depth, self-sacrifice. In short, the sort of thing which the calculus of preference knows nothing about. We truly live only through our values for Nietzsche. So expressed, it would seem that value may comprehend our highest aspirations, and that all aspirations, in fact, can be comprehended by the term value, as the genus comprehends the species. Today, I think everywhere we look, we see and hear people talking and writing about human values. These are, moreover, taken to include religious values. But it's just here, I think, that you've got a difficulty that arises, because according to Nietzsche, the situation in which we now find ourselves, which is he would call it the catastrophe after the destruction of Christianity in the West, is one in which religion is no longer possible. For now, we finally learn to be honest with ourselves. And so he says in a famous passage, what's the inner truth of Christianity and of Judaism? Truthfulness, honesty about fault. And he says, 2,000 years of training in truthfulness finally forbids the lie involved in the belief in God, so that the full unfolding of the Christian desire for truth leads to him to honest atheism. And so for him, the term value is invoked precisely because we live in a post-religious age. It's no longer possible to believe for Nietzsche. So we use the term, on Nietzsche's reading, the term religious value is an oxymoron. I hope you see this. It means if we use the term value, we're already presupposing a human-centric world, a world of creators, as opposed to a world in which God forms us. So my concern then is that to use this language is a very, very serious problem, because it's human-centric, and he deliberately moved us in this direction. He said, God is dead. Yes? So for Nietzsche then, religious experience cannot be a value, because the term value supposes already the impossibility of religious experience. Value has its correlative, the term meaning, and we talk about the search for a meaningful life. Prior to Nietzsche talking in terms of value and meaning, no believing soul would have said, I'm searching for meaning. This is a 20th century term. So religious experience does not use the language of meaning. Religious experience has as its correlative God, right? The chasm between value and religious experience can't be bridged by supposing that the commensability of meaning in religious experience is there. To speak of religious values then is to speak strangely, since value is something that we have as our own, right? But religious experience reveals that truly we have nothing of our own, that God is the author of our being, and that our relationship to the created world is that of a steward, not of an owner. So value is affirmative with respect to man, to human beings. But religious experience is deferential with respect to God. So what I'm trying to get us to think about is, to carry on from the theme of the previous speaker, the ecology of words that we use to understand our world. Right? So we were talking before about nature. I'm talking about the ecology of our minds now. And I think in a funny way, Nietzsche has won. That we do talk about values, we do talk about meaning, but I think Nietzsche was very clear about this. The invocation of that language was for the purpose of repudiating religion, and also for the purpose of repudiating that lesser thing called the Anglo-American project of global markets. So we invoke the term today, but I'm quite concerned about whether it's adequate to use it. And I will say, when I talk to my Muslim students, and I say, so in the West we use the term religious values, and they say, it's not a value, it's true. Right? It's not a value that I have, it's something that is true. And if you all want to run around and talk about the values that you have, that's fine, but I don't have a religious value, I just believe that Islam is true. So what I'm trying to raise here is if we're moving toward unanimity, what kind of language can we even use? And to repeat what I said at the outset, as a political theorist who studies language and ideas, I'm always reminded by how strange the world really is, and we superimpose upon this fundamental strangeness the language that happens to be passing through, and I'm worried that it's not fully adequate. So let's set aside the problematic origin of this term value and ask, what's the source of our longing for this global consensus? I think the most immediate source of that longing is the judgment that national destinies can no longer be disentangled from a larger global destiny, that we're moving towards one world in which once primordial national units are becoming subordinate units. I think the climate change argument is exactly this. This judgment presupposes, though, that the world is a system. And the term we use for this, of course, is globalization. Yes, that there's a system. An integrated whole which requires that the parts be coordinated so that the whole can work at all. One of the obvious examples where this occurs, of course, is our thinking about global economic system. And footnote, the person who probably sets this in motion, the idea of market commerce, is Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Now, what's really interesting about that book is that he never, go check it out, he never uses the word the economy. It is not a system for him. And when he's talking about entrepreneurship, he is suggesting, I'll use my language, not his, that commerce is a series of competing wagers about possible alternative futures. So on Adam Smith's reading, there is no economy. There's just a series of competing wagers about possible futures. So it's a highly open-ended understanding of the future. We can never name it. That's why we have decentralized markets. That's why we have occasional governmental elections, right? Because we can never know what the future is. But we've come to the point where we're thinking in terms of systems. And so we have too big to fail, right? Too big to fail means that there is this economic system out there. So as I said, the source of the longing is the judgment that we make that, in fact, we're living in a comprehensive whole. The parts have to be subordinate to the whole. I am suggesting, though, that with respect to the economy, there might actually be a prejudice here at work. It's not self-evident that there is a global system. And I will say, my own view, especially after living in the Middle East off and on for the last 10 years, is that this global system is about to come completely apart, that this was a 20 or 30 or 40-year experiment, and I'm not convinced at all it's going to work. But nevertheless, there is this longing for unanimity. But might there be another source for this longing for a comprehensive whole? Might those other sources, singly or in concert, in fact, better explain the longing, while at the same time suggest constraints for our aspirations for the whole? And this is where I'm going here. So I want to look at, just very, very briefly, the three authors who, if I have to pick three that I'm going to be marooned on an island with for the rest of my life, it would probably be Plato, Augustine, and Tocqueville. And just very, very briefly, they all three understood very different idioms, one philosophical, one theological, and one sociological, this immense longing for unity and unanimity. But what's interesting about them is they also have cautions about that, and that's what I want to work through here. So let me start with Augustine, right? How, he wonders, are we to understand ourselves in the world of time? Created out of nothing, made in God's image, called to worship God, yet by virtue of the fall of Adam, disposed to collapse into ourselves. We aspire to take upon ourselves the office of God, that we may heal the wounds of injustice in the world of time. And so the opening lines of the preface of Augustine's City of God are among them. We wait in steadfast patience until justice returns in judgment. Now, this is really an astounding claim, and it runs so counter to where we are at this particular moment. So for Augustine, by virtue of the fact that we are broken, we're never going to reach unanimity. I tell my students that we look to the far ranges of the universe for black holes, but Augustine understood that the human being is a black hole, always pulling everything within himself or herself. This is the problem of pride and sin. So powerful is this, there has to be a commandment to be pulled out of ourselves. So the problem is the brokenness of man, for Augustine, shows up both in the inability of human beings to achieve a kind of unanimity which God alone can achieve, but also this profound longing for it. So we, to use language that I'll come to in a bit, we desperately long to go home. We want unanimity. And so on this reading, on Augustine's reading, the particular crisis of the contemporary moment is that we are trying to bring about the end by ourselves. And so Augustine cites in one place the parable of the wheat and the tares, which some of you may know. The servant comes to the master and says, well, we've planted the wheat in the field, but I've noticed that the weeds have grown up among the wheat. should I go tear them out? And the master says, no, let's leave them to grow together so that we don't pull up the good weeds by pulling out the bad, pull up the good wheat by pulling out the bad wheat, leave them together until the harvest, and they'll be separated at the time of the harvest. Well, you know the symbolism here, right? So what's the wheat and the tares? It's good and evil in the world of time. Who's the master? God. Who's the servant? Us. What's our inclination? Our inclination is to separate and to finally come to the harvest. And the mystery of human existence in time for Augustine is that we can't do that. We're not the harvester. And so one way of looking at the contemporary moment is that we're trying to be the harvester. We're trying to say we're at the end of history, right? There's nothing more to accomplish. It's just climate change and, I'll be harsh on this, climate change and the debt allocations based on identity politics. This paper's on values. Identity to me is a very, very serious issue as well, and I'm not sure that language is adequate. That's a whole nother subject. But what I want us to get to think about is whether Augustine's telling us something that's worthwhile. Not sure you have to be a Christian to understand this, but the aspiration for unanimity, for universality is strong, and we should never give it up. But the great question is whether we can bring it about. That's Augustine. Now, let me just turn very briefly to Plato. So we're moving out of the theological idiom. Let me move to Plato, who I think is by far the greatest philosopher that's ever lived. So his magisterial work, The Republic, which I probably taught 60 times. And every time I go back to it, I learn more. It's about many things, but not least this. Where is our home? This is the subject of The Republic. And how we live both in the city of our birth, the city of generation, the city of our fathers and mothers, and what he calls the city set up in the heavens. And from the very first pages, The Republic wrestles with the age-old question of whether the inheritance, our cultural inheritance of the fathers and the mothers, broadly understood, is sufficient for us. Can our fathers give us what he needs in his language? At its most sublime moment in the dialogue, at the end of Book 6, Book 7, Plato suggests that the person whose soul is just must have turned away from the world of shadows and seen the light of the good. So we talk about bringing justice in the world of time. Plato understood the impulse. But his argument is that in order to understand justice, we have to have turned. This is why the allegory of the cave at the beginning of Book 7 is the most famous image in all of Western philosophy. And he says there, once seen, the light of the good, which requires that we turn away from the world of shadows, which is the world of coming into being and passing away, the conclusion is irresistible that the cause of all things, right and good, and the sovereign author of truth and reason, is the light of the good. And there can never be justice in the world of time until you and I have seen that. Never. Because we're divided and against ourselves, and there will always be war. To have seen the light of the good is to have seen the source of our generation. It's to recognize that we are orphans in our fathers and mothers' homes, that our true home is not to be found in the home of our mortal generation. This formulation, like Augustine's, which antedates it by 900 years, is hauntingly similar in its conclusion, if not for the same reason. Here we intimate that we are somehow homeless in this world below, and that our task is to make the journey home. Yet on Plato's account, absent an awakening of what he calls divine reason, we cannot see beyond the shadows that daily occupy us. So situated, the half-lit mind concludes that all things are relative, that there is no truth. Unchanging truth and luminous beauty are too bright for the shadow dwellers to see. Hence the Platonic formulation, only philosophy can save us. No institutions, no education, only philosophy can save us. Here alone is the basis for accord, for justice, for unanimity, for consensus. Without philosophy, Plato says, we are more akin like animals than human beings. And here's his picture of human life unless we turn to philosophy. Like cattle, men graze, fatten, and copulate. Greed drives them to kick and butt one another with horns and hooves of iron. This is war. Because they are insatiable, they slay one another. Look at the roots of the climate change problem. It's our insatiable appetites. And they are insatiable because they neglect to seek the real refreshment for that part of the soul which is real and pure. Right? So on his reading, we're not going to get there unless we awaken something. And the Platonic paradox is the thing that we most need is the thing that we're most likely to turn away from. And so life will be nothing but a continuing passing shadows. We have to do what we can, but we're never going to be able to bring the kingdom into the world of time. So let me turn in a different direction, away now from theology and philosophy and toward my favorite sociologist of all, the one who I think is the last one standing after the whole of the 19th century and 20th century sociological experiment. So it's not off the mark to read Tocqueville's Democracy in America as an extended rumination on the sorts of ideas that seem to effortlessly arise to the mind of what he calls the democratic soul. And read Democracy in America and ask yourself, do I have a democratic soul? And the answer is going to be yes. All of us have democratic souls. What distinguishes the democratic soul above all is that it is no longer a bound soul. So you think of the problem of anomie sociologically, you think of the problem of loneliness, disconnectedness. I tell my students Facebook is death because real human contact, I'm serious about that by the way, real human contact is the only thing that's going to save us. And we're raising a generation of people who are not in real contact. We don't even, fortunately my Middle Eastern students actually call their friends on the phone, but that's not true here. We text message, right? Because a phone conversation is entirely too awkward for us, yes? So we're delinked. This is the great crisis of the democratic age for him. He says, aristocracy links everybody from peasant to king in one long chain. Democracy breaks the chain and frees the link. Thus, not only does democracy make men forget their ancestors, but it clouds their view of their descendants and isolates them from their contemporaries. Each man is forever thrown back on himself, and there is a danger that he may be shut up in the solitude of his own heart. Wrote that in 1835. In this novel condition, the democratic soul is liberated from the links that currently bind him or her to others, and also the links between the generations. As this occurs, Tocqueville thought the mind would imagine a fugitive perfection that the aristocratic soul cannot possibly imagine. And so here's his description of this. To escape from imposed systems, the yoke of habit, family maxims, class prejudices, and to a certain extent national prejudices as well, to treat tradition as valuable for information only, to accept existing facts as no more than a useful sketch. These are some of the characteristics of what I would call the democratic method. So this shows up in the most subtle of ways. So our students, they don't want to spend a lot of time reading a difficult book. They want the Cliff Notes version of reality because everybody's in a hurry. Yes? So there are 1,000 ways in which this shows up, but what Tocqueville's getting at here, is a beautiful chapter on this, he says, in the aristocratic age, people realize that there's a series of trade-offs in life, and there can never be parsimony, never. You do a little bit of this, and it causes this problem. So as one political philosopher from the 20th century said, the art of politics, therefore, has to be the art of taking the next step. Because there is no principled truth, left or right, that the person who really understands that the human situation is not parsimonious cannot be a partisan. This person has to realize that we can have amelioration, but we can never have transformative change. And Tocqueville's point, we have to be very clear on this, is that this idea of complete breaking can only occur once you and I have been delinked and cut off. The idea occurs to the mind. He doesn't say it's true or false. He says the idea occurs to the mind. And so the cosmopolitan idea occurs to the mind, namely that we can get rid of all of the limits that have heretofore constricted us. And this, if I may, this leads Tocqueville to suggest that the disease from which we all suffer is romanticism. And what he means by this is that we all hover over the world, see the limits of making any sort of purchase on the world, because once we're cut off and delinked, we sense ourselves to be weak and alone, and to make any purchase is to further delimit us. And so we hover over the world thinking about infinite possibility. Think of all the television ads and radio commercials about there are no limits, the sky's the limit. This can only occur once all the social conditions, or once the social links have been broken, right? So Tocqueville sees this too, and one way of understanding Tocqueville is that the whole of the project of democracy in America is to thrust us back into embedded life. Because if we're not in embedded life and embedded communities, we're going to suffer from the romantic dream that thinks that all things are possible, and they're not. So I want to now go to the third question. Are there limits, I've been given it away, to which mortal life is subject, which preclude the achievement of global political values? The three thinkers I have only casually considered here think that those limits do exist. One of the great mysteries for life for Augustine stems from the inscrutability of the situation in which we find ourselves, thrown into a world we did not make, animated by forces we cannot fully understand, enticed by temptations we cannot fully escape. Our lived experience makes parsimony with ourselves and with others well nigh impossible. To ask more is to ask for a degree of understanding and control we simply do not have. Plato too recognized the limits set to mortal life and found them mysterious as well. Persons as we find them suffer, he says, from a mortal sickness. But it is a sickness like pregnancy is a sickness. That's why in the Theaetetus, this other dialogue, Socrates calls himself a midwife. At times, he says, I come across people who do not seem to me somehow to be pregnant. Then I realize they have no need of me. So the great divide for Plato is not racial, it's not identity groups, it's not national, it's between the pregnant and the unpregnant. And so his task is to go through the market and to find those who are on the verge, who are wrestling with the contradictions, on the verge to giving birth, which he can assist but not cause. That's the challenge of mortal life. And we can do nothing beyond that. Unlike Augustine and Plato, the limits set to mortal life are sociologically understood. In the democratic age, we rightly intimate that we have been freed from the links that once held us fast, but from there conceive the imprudent project of freeing ourselves from limits altogether and creating ourselves wholly out of ourselves. This is the language of meaning and value that Nietzsche gives us, not incidentally, in Tocqueville's democratic age. So here we find the scourge of the democratic age, the real problem, the soul that hovers over the world but never quite enters into it, whose engagement is finally virtual and at a distance. This is why Facebook is death. And so for many of our young people, all interaction is merely ironic. Right? So the task at hand. My remarks have thus far deliberately pointed to the immense difficulty associated with the Global Values Project. Conceding in advance the difficulty, what then is possible? Here I think two distinct alternatives emerge. One let's call base, the other let's call noble. The base alternative is to set our sights lower. And here I'm going to sound like a classic liberal, capital L liberal, right? To aspire not to a consensus on values, but rather on a more short-lived and contingent consensus based on preferences and interests. So one of the famous passages that the capital L liberals would point to is Voltaire, who in his letters on England, 1750 or thereabouts, contains this passage: I go to the English stock market and I find Muslim, Christian, and Jew bartering with one another, and they don't care about each other's religion so long as their money is good. Now, this is an important insight. It's, would we love to have a global consensus on the true religion or true value? Yes, we would. But sometimes we're not going to get it. In fact, most times we're not. So the liberal position is let's set our sights lower. Let's set our sights on commerce. Is it the highest in human life? Absolutely not. But the alternative is worse. You don't choose something because you don't choose markets because they're good. You choose them because the alternative, namely war and violence, is worse. Right? That's the liberal position. So I may not share my values with my neighbors, and that may be an obstacle to concord, but we may discover interests in common that allow us to work together. Now let me talk about the nobler one. It's one I'm actually working on these days in the Middle East and on the Georgetown campus. The nobler alternative involves the recognition that somewhere between an unachievable ecumenical horizon that so many today long for and a world of incommensurable civilizations that so many today fear, there lies this third alternative, which I'm calling, because I do history of political philosophy, I'm calling comparative canonical inquiry, because I think this is the challenge of the 21st century. We can talk about it in questions, but let me just describe this briefly. I think through this device we can begin, and it's a device, a global conversation that neither starts from the pretense that there's a universal human discourse, nor from the supposition that reifies civilizational groups within them into sacrosanct and impervious identities. Beyond the blur of events, beyond the well-worked-out oppositions on which political parties and sloganeers thrive around the globe, lies a third alternative, which seeks to return to the texts of durable civilizations to trace their development through their developments through the ideas that have registered in their respective canons. The crude beginning of this is already taking shape. It's not impossible to imagine a day, moreover, when a new generation of scholars with a deep and reverential knowledge of their own inheritance sets itself the noble goal of placing before students around the globe the great ideas that have shaped civilizations, not in the form of taste-testing survey courses, which make all such ideas unpalatable, but in the form of an extended feast which demonstrates beyond a reasonable doubt why those ideas have nourished the hearts and minds of generations. Tocqueville wrote, "Variety is disappearing from the human race." I suspect that only something like comparative canonical inquiry can provide a foundation substantial enough for members of different civilizations to engage in the kinds of conversations that would be required if we are to greet each other under the banner of hospitality during the rest of this troubled century and beyond. So why, I have other things I could read, but I'm not going to. So let me just describe the problem. I'm in the Middle East. My students come to me with a very long litany of colonial grievances, and I nod my head in agreement. Yep, yep, yep. And after they're done, I say, so now what are you going to do? How are you going to build a world? What are you going to use to build a world? And so modern Western philosophy is roughly divided into liberal and anti-liberal, modern and anti-modern. And my students, because they see the grievances caused by the liberal project, have turned very much to anti-modern thoughts. They've turned to Marx, they've turned to Nietzsche, they've turned to Heidegger, they've turned to Rousseau. And so it's very curious to me that their response to the colonial experience is itself European. It's to invoke European anti-modern ideas to address the problem of European modern ideas. And my view is the project of the 21st century is a much deeper one. It's going to, if civilizations around the globe are going to really find their own internal animus, they're going to have to retrieve. They can't rely on either liberal Western notions or anti-liberal Western notions. There's going to have to be an act of retrieval. And the good news is this is actually happening. I see this already, the development of a field called comparative politics. But the most interesting thing is the young people in their 20s and 30s who are going on to graduate school. I've had Chinese students come into my office and say, you know, this sort of Marxist capitalist thing that we're doing, it's not going to work. And I've had Persian students come into me and say, you know, this is not going to work. And students from all over the globe, the young people realize that we're going to have to move beyond modern and anti-modern. We're going to have to retrieve. And so what I want to do is to recognize that this project of comparative canonical inquiry is going to be an incredibly difficult one. It must start from the premise that there isn't a universal language, because only by doing that will we be forced to listen to the terms within which human experience is understood in different civilizations. So I do not want to start from the beginning by saying, yes, we all have global values, now what are yours? I think this is absolutely the wrong way to go. We're going to have to rebuild a world that's going to have to be pluralist, but I think unless people from different civilizations have recourse to the categories of experience, to use my language, that are their own by inheritance, my worry is we're going to move back and forth between liberal and anti-liberal tropes around the globe that will not help us build the 21st century. I'll stop with that.